So welcome everyone. It is so great to see so many of you joining. And the topic today obviously is saving time with generative AI insights for small charities. So I know Sally's already asked for everyone to introduce themselves. If I can also add in for you to put on a scale of 1 to 10, where 1 is not at all and 10 is all of the time, how much are you currently using generative AI in the work that you're doing, just so we can get a sense of who's in the room and how familiar we are with AI. I would personally put myself around a 8 out of 10. I use it pretty much every day, but in using it, I'm always learning new ways to use it. So I'd never want to put myself at a full 10 and sort of claim to know everything. So hopefully I can share with you the experience I've gained over the past few years of using it. But also, please, as we go, if you've got examples where you've got something related, how you've used it, or you've run into some issues, do put it in the chat and we can explore that when we get to the Q&A at the end. So moving into the agenda, what I will do is, just to make sure we all have a sort of similar foundational level, I will very briefly touch on what generative AI actually is and explore some of the key concepts and a few examples of different types of generative AI that exists. Then, as we move into how to actually use it, I find it's really helpful to conceptualize generative AI as an eager intern, and I'll explain why as we go through. But again, there'll be a little bit of that slightly theoretical side of how to think about it and how to approach it in a safe, responsible way before moving on to getting into some proper demos of different ways you could use it and think about using it to save time and also just increase the quality and efficiency of the work that you're doing. Then I'll go into prompt crafting. So I'll do the demo first and then describe how I've written the different prompts to get the most out of AI and give you, again, general approaches for how you can then put that into practice and improve the prompting that you're doing for AI. And then, as I said, we'll wrap up with some Q&A at the end. And so please do put any questions or any comments into the chat as we go along. But let's get started just with terminology. So starting firstly with artificial intelligence. Artificial intelligence is essentially technology that allows computers to mimic human intelligence. It develops from feeding it very large amounts of data, which it then recognizes patterns from, and then starts to either make decisions or generate content with quite minimal human intervention. The important thing, I think it's always important to note with artificial intelligence is it is not a new thing. I think artificial intelligence in some forms has been around since the 50s and the 60s. And has been used in all forms of tracking diseases, surveillance, content creation, everything in between. And so it is only really at this point that we're all starting to think about it as part of the general public, because we've had both sort of our technological hardware get to a point that they can build these huge data centers that can process generative AI really quickly for us. The software and the coding has gone to a certain level, but also there's just now huge amounts of data since the internet came along that they've then been able to train AI on. And so it's sort of that culmination that means that it currently feels very new and very quickly developing, because we've needed all three of those factors to come together into this sort of heyday of AI, if we can call it that. And I'll come back to that in a moment as to how it's formed then brings with it certain risks and certain things we need to be aware of when we're using it as well. But that's sort of AI in a nutshell. And then generative AI is a specific type of subset of AI. So this is AI that specifically has been developed to create new content based on the data it's been trained on. Originally, this was just text-based, but then it very quickly moved into images, into music, podcasts now, videos, and it's got a huge range of things that it can generate. So it's quite exciting to see how it's developed, but it also means that very quickly we can fall out of pace with it. So it's important to keep up with it, to see how it grows and to grow with it. And throughout, as you can see, I've got it in the brackets, I'll be referring to it just Gen AI for short, to just save a little bit of time from saying generative AI every single time. And some examples of generative AI which you may not have used or you may have heard of, just to sort of ground it in reality a little bit more. Firstly, we've got ChatGPT, which was created by OpenAI. This exists both as a standalone tool, where you can just go onto its website and type in, which I'll be demoing in a minute. But it also is now the foundation for a huge host of different companies' generative AI products as well. So if you go on to different websites that have chatbots or sort of image generators where you can, there's a trend for a while to make an AI version of your profile picture. Those are mostly using OpenAI's ChatGPT as its foundation, and just they've integrated that and then used it for a special use. And that's important to remember as well, because all of the AIs will have been trained differently and with different data. And so it's useful to know which one you're using in different situations, because it will come with its own benefits, but also drawbacks as well. So ChatGPT is the one that has very much dominated the headlines. The other big ones are Gemini, which was created by Google, and Copilot, which was created by Microsoft. These are now, again, they can both exist as standalone, but they're increasingly being integrated into things like Google Workspace or Microsoft 360. And so you'll probably have started to see over the past few weeks or months, their little icons appearing and sort of asking if it can assist with different tasks you're doing within either Google Docs or Microsoft Excel. A little bit like the old Clippy used to in the very olden days of Microsoft. So it's just now starting to be integrated into processes, which just means you can use it much more efficiently rather than having to go to a separate program to be able to use Gen AI. And then two other just examples that you might not have thought of from a generative AI point of view is Canva and Grammarly. I know these have been for years very popular, especially among small charities, because you can get free access to the pro version of Canva. Both of these now are very strongly AI powered. Canva, for example, there's a lot of their new sort of tools around video editing that's AI based. A lot of their image generation is AI based now. You can, if you have an image, you can select an area and grab it and remove it, and it sort of AI fills in what might have been behind based on what else is in the image. So I think just wanted to highlight with this, you're going to increasingly see generative AI built into the different tools that you're already using. And so again, it's useful to have that foundational knowledge of how to use it well so that it can enhance your work across everything that you're doing. These are obviously just very common ones, but if people are using sort of special tools that you've already tried, please do put it in the chat, so we can get a bit of peer sharing going of other tools that you've experienced and used. But hopefully that gives us a good shared foundation on Gen AI. Let's get into a little bit more of the focus of the webinar around how to actually save time with it. And what has helped me and the charities I've worked with in thinking about it is to try and, I guess, humanize generative AI so that you can think about how it can actually fit in alongside you and the work that you're doing. And the analogy I found really helpful is to think of it like an eager intern. So like an eager intern, it has a very broad knowledge base, and is really eager and keen to help you with whatever task you want to give it. It's very enthusiastic, it works very quickly, and it follows the directions you give to the letter. But like a real intern, that means that they don't necessarily have the specialized sort of experience and knowledge that you're having in giving the instructions. So in following your directions to the letter, it may have completely misunderstood what you're wanting or lacking the context to do it well. And so might produce results that aren't right, or maybe even makes up information in the hopes that it's managed to fulfill the requirements of what you've asked it, and hope you don't notice. So I think that analogy just highlights a few key things to bear in mind whenever you're trying to use it to save time and to improve your work. Firstly, guidance is absolutely crucial. So just like you would with an intern, it's important that you give context to your instructions, that you provide clear instructions, and you also give feedback so that it has the ability to improve upon what it's done the first time round. And as I mentioned, we'll come on to prompt crafting in a minute about how you can write effective prompts so that you can give it the guidance it needs in a later part of the webinar. The other aspect of, much like talking to an intern, you should be engaging in conversation rather than just having a transactional giving it instructions. So it's important that you actively talk to the AI, whether you're using voice commands or typing, to engage in a conversation with it. So ask it questions, check if it understands what you've asked it to do, refine your requests based on what it says, and then give it more guidance to be able to improve its input. So really think about this more as a back and forth rather than a one and done way of using it. And again, in the demo, I'll show how that works. The third thing to bear in mind is that mistakes will happen. We often think about technology as sort of this objective, perfect thing, but it is not. It has its own flaws that are built into it. It has its own limitations based on the data it's been trained on. So it may provide, depending on what subscription you have, outdated information. It may miss context, or it might produce content that isn't quite fit for your needs. So your role will always be to have a sort of critical approach to evaluate what it's put out and then adjust it as you need it. And this will be very central as we move on in a moment to talking about the principles for safe use for AI. And then finally, think about using AI as a partnership. So just like with an intern, you share and learn from one another. And so thinking about using Gen AI as combining its capabilities with your expertise rather than completely outsourcing the activity. And the beauty of this is that working together, you can achieve so much more than either the technology or yourself would probably have been able to do by yourselves. And so it's important to have that mindset throughout your working with it. And I specifically use the word partnership because that includes a level of respect. And research has shown that saying things like please and thank you in your prompts to AI does come up with a better output. So it is important to show that and to integrate that into how you use it, because you will get much more positive outputs, you produce better results. And honestly, it just feels like a more meaningful interaction as the human end as well. If you're not just do this for me, do that, okay, goodbye. It's nice to work and see that grow together. So hopefully that helps you conceptualize it so that you can approach it with realistic expectations and approach it to think about it as something that you have to manage rather than just like a printer, you give a command and then it prints out. It is an ongoing conversation and partnership that you need to have in place. With that in mind, I think it's also very important, like with having a new member of staff or bringing on any new technology, to be aware of the risks that can be involved in using it, especially where you're using it for important or sensitive tasks. And so I thought I'd just bring up some of the key ones and then think about how we can use it safely before we go into doing the demo. And the reason I've structured it this way is I think it's always best to approach things with clear intention and expectations, because then you get the most out of it rather than diving in, maybe doing things that in hindsight you wish you hadn't, and then having consequences, especially where you're dealing with sensitive or important data. So first key risk of Gen AI is misinformation. I think there's been a lot that's been talked about in the media about generative AI. In the absence of any data, it will make stuff up. So it does what's called hallucinations. And I think we often blame the technology for it, but I think we can think back to either when we were students or we've interacted with students and they're writing an important essay and they need a stat, they can't find it, so they just say something that sounds right and hope no one questions it. So the technology does the same thing there. Again, depending on your subscription or which tool you're using. Some of them have limits on how recent the information it is. So I know ChatGPT, if you're using the free version, I'm not sure what the latest date is, but it's usually about a year or so out of date. So if you're relying on it for the up-to-date news, it won't be able to do that. So it's important to be aware of that in sort of this category of misinformation. Next aspect is data security. And I think this is just important to think of this as any other tool you're using. It is a third-party tool. If you're putting data into it, there's security aspects that you need to be aware of. So even just uploading something to it, you're then putting that data in another account that can be hacked. So it's important to be aware of that. But the other aspect of generative AI is, especially free accounts, it uses what people put into it as part of its data and it's part of its training. And so you never quite know if that data is being used for training, where it might end up in future. And so it's important that you bear that in mind and consider that as part of whether you use a free or paid service. And again, I'll come on to sort of principles for safe use just after this. The other aspect is bias. So AI, as I mentioned, has been trained using huge sources of data, much of which has come from the internet. And as I'm sure we're all aware, when we use the internet, there are a vast range of viewpoints and perspectives, and obviously, unfortunately, a lot of biases and prejudices that are baked into the internet. And so if it's been trained on that, it may perpetuate that. It's not at this stage conscious, and so it doesn't know whether what it's reproducing is good or bad. And so that is something to be really aware of, especially when we're working often as small charities with highly marginalized or vulnerable communities, to think about what the content that comes out of AI might be perpetuating. And all of that is sort of linked into reputational risk. So if you perpetuate a bias that you wouldn't otherwise do, that's a risk. Using outdated information, having a security breach, all of these could come together to harm the overall charity's credibility and reputation. I don't mean to scaremonger, but it's just important to be aware of this. So how do we mitigate and overcome some of these risks? First thing is to always apply critical thinking. Do not just give the AI the thing and walk away from it. You are the human, you are the person that ultimately is responsible for what you use it for. So make sure you apply that critical eye to it and you review anything, especially where it's sensitive or public facing, to make sure that it aligns with your charity's style, values, and tone. Also think about the suitability. Generative AI, just because it can generate, doesn't mean it's the best tool for every situation. So there might be things that require unique human touch or a more nuanced understanding or expertise that it can't necessarily provide. So thinking about where it can genuinely save that time or add value for you, rather than just a blanket, whatever I'm doing, we apply generative AI to it. Thirdly, thinking about accuracy and sources. Just as anything that you'd be preparing, make sure that you check where the data has come from. And this is something you can come back to the AI. If it's come up with a stat, you can ask it to quote its sources and then check that source to make sure that it is a legitimate source and a source that you would want to be associated with, just to make sure that, again, that misinformation isn't starting to creep in. Equality, diversity, and inclusion. I think it's just absolutely important that anything it comes out with, you have that lens in mind to review what it's putting out. And again, a nice thing about generative AI is you can also ask it to review its own material. So if you've asked it to write a case study, you could then ask it to review that, bearing in mind some of the prejudices that the community that you're writing the case study about might experience, for it to check whether it's perpetuating any of those. Again, I would always say come back to number one and apply your critical thinking as well. But it's a good way of getting it to recognize anything it's perpetuated and then adding your own critical viewpoints to it as well, just to make sure that anything you're putting out, again, is aligned with the values and views of your organization. data protection and cybersecurity, this is where I'd recommend, as you use it, to start integrating this into your existing policies. So be very careful about any sensitive data that you're putting in. Personally, what I do is I usually anonymize the information I put in if it is sensitive. So I might have what I want to end up with in a separate document, and I'll control find and replace all the names and sort of end up putting in name 1, name 2, name 3, organization 1, organization 2, organization 3 in a code that I obviously remember how to de-anonymize it. And then I'll put that into my, I have paid versions of Gen AI to then come up with, if it's the report or letter or whatever it is, I then take it out and I separately de-anonymize it for use. So there are different ways that you can use it where you do protect the overall sensitivity of the data you're using. An aspect I think people forget about with data protection and cybersecurity is data retention. So when you put something in a generative AI program, it creates a sort of library of all the queries that you've put through it, and it stores that for a long time. And so as you've used it potentially for a few years, quite a lot can accumulate in there where, again, it could be sensitive information if that account was hacked. So just bear in mind your own internal data retention policies and clear out old discussions over time as well. So you're not unnecessarily storing, again, additional information in yet another source that could be compromised if the account was hacked, for example. And then my final point just on this is to think about using AI in terms of upskilling rather than replacing. So again, see it as that partner that enhances what you're doing, that can be a generative source for ideas or inspiration, rather than completely replacing a skill that you've spent years developing. And this just means that you grow together and you benefit from the efficiencies of the AI without necessarily losing those skills and abilities that you already have. So the reason I raise this is, again, as you explore using it, especially working within an organization, it's important to put these principles for safe use in place. So if you don't really use it at all at the moment within the charity, I'd suggest just coming up even with a one-pager of these are our principles that you could base on this. That's what I did in my previous organization. And that just creates those safe boundaries for people experimenting with different tools. If you're already at a point that you know which tools you want to use and you want to just improve your effectiveness of using it, then I would suggest using this as the basis for an internal policy and fleshing that out as your AI use policy and seeing where else, like your data protection or cybersecurity policies, you might then need to make explicit reference to AI as well. But that's sort of the very foundational level, which hopefully means that everyone feels comfortable going into how to actually use it. So let's go into the practical examples of how it can save time for your organization. So what I thought would be useful to do here is to talk through some generic examples and then give you a live demo so you can see it sort of in practice, especially for those of you who maybe have never even opened a Gen AI tool before. I will personally be using ChatGPT. The way it looks is very similar to other platforms as well. The reason I use ChatGPT is purely because that's what I have a paid subscription for. But this is by no means a promotion for them. Many tools exist. Please choose the one that's most suitable for you. So the first way that I highly recommend thinking about how it can save time for you is overcoming blank page syndrome. So I know when we're in a small charity, so there's so many tasks that we have to do that all fall onto the shoulders of very few team members. And a lot of that is just creating new documents, new reports, new summaries, new images, new videos. And there's a lot of just sitting and opening a blank piece of paper and not knowing where to start. And this is where generative AI can really help with starting from that sort of just small concept of an idea and really building it out into a concept, into a first draft, and into something that you can then edit and work with and develop yourself. So I like to think about generative AI not just as an eager intern, but also a little bit like the hive mind of it's a collection of publicly available information that as humanity we have gathered together on the internet. And so it's very rare that we're doing something for the absolute first time. And so drawing on generative AI to say, I'm thinking about doing X, how should I approach this, is already a great way of getting, this is what the average internet user has suggested, accumulated across all the different blogs and articles and everything. This is a general place to start, and it can then help guide your thinking. So my example for this comes from real life. So this, about 6 months ago, I had the task of completely redoing all of the health and safety policies for a charity I was working with. And as a non-health and safety expert myself, I needed some foundation on which to base this so that we can then tailor it for our very specific circumstances as a charity. And so what I did was, obviously, I had a quick Google, as I'm sure we all do, of other organizations and seeing their health and safety policies. I gathered a few examples. I uploaded that to ChatGPT and set out what we needed, and then used that to generate my first draft, which we then, as a team, refined to make sure that it was considering all the different aspects of what we did as an organization and reflected all of the different needs of our stakeholders. But for this demo, and I will hopefully now switch you over, I thought I would give you a demo of trying to write a health and safety policy for Acme Charity, which is a small charity based in the UK. So I've written out my prompt in advance just to save a little bit of time, but I will read this out to you and highlight why I've said certain things. So the first aspect is that I wanted to write a health and safety policy for the charity, small charity based in Cambridge, UK, running community events for vulnerable adults. And as I mentioned earlier, this is giving a very clear, this is what I want you to do, and giving it quite a bit of context as to who it's for and what situation it might be needed for. So it's not just a generic health and safety policy, it's one for an organization that's doing a very specific activity. I then have moved on to giving it a very clear role, which is to write it as a health and safety officer with an expertise, again, in small charities and safeguarding vulnerable adults. Having looked around at different health and safety policies, I can see some of the key areas that need to be included. So that includes the responsibilities of different stakeholders, the different risk assessments and control measures we'll need, training and information, emergency procedures, monitoring review, communications, and consultation. So I've got that sense of that's what needs to be in there. I've then asked it to keep it fairly concise, under 1,000 words. And one thing I'd really highly recommend everyone remembers to do to check any generative AI is to remind it to use British English spelling. It uses American English as a default. And initially, when I first started using AI, I then manually went through and changed it, which wasted a lot of time. So in the spirit of saving time, just remember to give it that very precise requirement to do English spelling, British English spelling. And then what I really recommend everyone think about is always test your assumptions before you send the prompt. So have you actually given it everything it needs? I always ask this question of, do you have any questions? Do you need any additional information? Because it just causes the Gen AI tool to just take a moment to think, actually, I have no idea what you're asking me to do. So I've got 5 questions. Here you go. And then what I've done here, just in the spirit of time, is I've then also asked it to review how well it thinks it's done once it's generated the policy for us, and then to highlight any changes it thinks it needs to make it even better. Usually, and as we go into prompt graph, I'd recommend doing this after it's done its first sort of draft, but this just means that we can go through it a little bit more in the demo. So that is my prompt. I've submitted it to it. It's very confident. It says it's got no questions. It knows exactly what I need. So it's just gone straight into it. And then you can see it starting to go through. It's following my directions. It's got a little bit of an introduction. It's focusing on the responsibilities for both the charity, the employees, for beneficiaries. It started to look at what kind of risk assessments we might need, some control measures that might need to be put in place. And what I can do actually, which I've done with similar training, is I will download this conversation and share it so that you can review it in a bit more detail as an example of what you get out with this prompt. And if you happen to have time, an exercise might be writing your own version of that prompt and seeing what comes out, just so you can see that comparison between different prompt styles. As you can see, as I've been talking, it's gone through monitoring, review, communication, and then it's reviewed itself and thinks it's done a pretty good job. It thinks it's done about an 8 out of 10, but it thinks that it probably needs to put in more detail on incident reporting procedures, might need to strengthen its training and add a formal procedure for consulting beneficiaries. So what I might do here is go, thank you, that's a great first draft. Always remembering to be polite. Please add in your recommendations to the policy. And it'll now go through and sort of add that in as we go. What I'd recommend here is this is where you would take over as the human and have that critical thinking approach to think, okay, this is a great first draft. It's given me something that I can put in a document and review, and then to test it to go, okay, does this cover this scenario for our organization? Does it cover this scenario for the organization? How does this reflect actually how many team members we have? Can we have every single role that it says here? Are there any additional specific regulations that are relevant to my organization? For example, if we're in a care setting or if we're working with animals, that hasn't necessarily been reflected in this policy. So I'd suggest taking that away, doing that critical work yourself, and then bringing it back and uploading it and saying, you know, I've refined it in these ways. What do you think of this? Rate it on the same standards that we had at the start, because it will then have quite a lot of recommendations and suggestions that you can come back to and refine it even further. And that's where that conversation aspect comes in. So I would keep this chat live and come back to it and add to it over time, rather than sort of deleting this, closing it off, and then having to restart the conversation. And the benefit of that is most generative AI, when you're talking to it within the specific chatbot here, it retains the context that it's talked to you about up until that point. And so you don't have to give it all that context again when you next start the conversation. You can close this, come back in 2 weeks' time, and continue this specific conversation, and it carries on as if no time has passed at all. So moving back, so that's sort of how to overcome that blank page and get that first draft going. The other aspect that it is hugely beneficial for is around summarizing information. So this is where you already have something and you need it in different contexts. So if you're writing a report for your board, let's say, if you're like me, it might be going on to sort of 8+ pages, and you need that sort of 3 or 4 paragraph summary for the start. Putting it in, obviously appropriately anonymized if needed, it can then come up with that executive summary where it's just taking your words and just making it into that concise executive summary. Likewise, if a big research project has happened and you've received a report that's, you know, often 60+ pages, and you want very specific bits of information. So let's say a big report has come out on the state of fundraising in the UK, but you want to see what the status is for, let's say, local charities that focus on rescuing donkeys. You don't necessarily want to have to scan through yourself, but you can upload the report to something like ChatGPT and say, please find the keynotes related to charities that rescue donkeys. And it will scan through and it will bring out those key points that you can then read, absorb, and then see if you want to go back for further information. So it's very good at just summarizing any big document that you might have. Likewise, it can be very helpful at preparing minutes or meeting summaries. If you've got just very long, rough notes, it can summarize that for you very nicely. And also, it's not just creating summaries using that tone and that text. You can upload, let's say, your big evaluation report and ask it to generate some of those first drafts of social media friendly updates about that report. So you could put it in and say, here is my report. I would like a tweet for this. I would like a Facebook post, and I would like a LinkedIn. These are the tones of voice that we use on these different platforms. And it will generate you that first draft. Again, I'd recommend not just taking it immediately and posting it, but it's a really great way of just picking out and even just testing with yourself of what does it think is the most important thing or the most interesting thing from a social media point of view? How does that compare to what I think? And either you can learn from it or you can go, actually, no, what I was going to approach with is better, so I'm just going to keep that. So it can be helpful as that peer comparison as well. But the demo I thought I'd use here is summarizing rough meeting notes into concise minutes. I know some AI tools now exist that take meeting notes live as things are happening. I, at the moment, don't like those, but I know this is a recording, so I'm going to try and future-proof it. At this moment in time, it doesn't understand different accents very well, and it can completely misunderstand different words, which can lead to some very difficult situations. So when we used this a few months ago, we were talking to maths tutors, and it noted that down as mass shooters. And that obviously was not an appropriate thing to put in a meeting note and then generate into minutes. So with anything, mistakes happen. And so at the moment, we still do manual meeting notes, but then we might use those rough notes and have AI transcribe them into more of a meeting notes, meeting summary example. So again, I will bring this up as an example. So I will start a new chat, and I have with ChatGPT pre-prepared some meeting notes, which is a great time saver. If you ever need to do a demo, you can use generative AI to make the examples that it then uses to demonstrate how it can be used. So here again, what I'm asking it to do is I've uploaded the very rough meeting notes, and I'm asking it to summarize it into concise minutes. I've given it, again, a very clear role that this is a meeting secretary who's documenting key decisions and actions. I've laid out what kind of things I want it to have. So I need that very formal date, location, attendees, key decisions made, and action items. I don't want any fluff. I want it to just get to what's been agreed. And I want it to be very, very concise with 300 words tops and bullet points. And again, I've asked it if it needs any more information, and then asked it to do a rating of itself at the end of how well it's done. So I've put that in, didn't have any questions again this time. Again, I should specify all of this is fake. So if you recognize any real names, that is purely coincidental. And this was just an example of, you can see it's picked out what key decisions were made, separate to then what actions, and it said who all the people are. And also just highlighted a few notes on some extra things that were discussed, but we haven't actually quite actioned yet. And so it thinks it's done a great job. So it doesn't think much more needs to be added here. But again, as the human involved, what I would do is I would just use both my memory and my notes to check back, make sure I haven't noted anything that it has thought was unimportant, but that we actually had a much lengthier discussion that ended up going into the notes and adding to it. But for a basic sort of committee meeting summary, this is already a great place to start, and has meant that that's happened in about 5 seconds rather than half an hour that it might have otherwise taken. My third example is around generating design concepts. And so this is the very interesting place where it can help with less text and more image-based, video-based conceptualizations. So where I've used this before is I was working with an organization, and we had some very clear idea of t-shirt designs that we wanted to come up with, but none of us were visually very creative people or could actually draw that. And where we tried to work with freelancers before to create the designs, it took so much back and forth of us going, this is what we want. They interpreted it their way. It came back, we went, that's not what we want. And it wasted a lot of time and also cost a lot of money for every set of revisions. And so what we did was we kind of discussed what we wanted, and then I used the image generation version of ChatGPT, which is called DALL-E, to put in, this is the type of design, this is the type of image that we want, and had it generate out a few basic images, which I then refined by going, okay, that, but remove this, add this, do that differently. And ultimately, we had a design concept that I then showed back, and everyone said, yes, that's the type of thing we want, which we then took to a human designer. And I think we had a couple of very minor revision tweaks of just changed the angle on that or changed that ever so slightly. But it was basically just they could immediately see what we wanted and then do it professionally and to the right scale and with the right colors and branding and everything included, which cut out weeks of time and hundreds of pounds worth of design revisions just by going through and having it visualized with AI first. So that's what I really recommend. Is it's not just doing this instead of working with a human. It can be that first, let's just conceptualize it, get what's in my head down on page, and then give it to another human being to actually do it properly and to the level that we want it to. And so it can do that, but it can also give you suggestions. So if you're starting with, we want a new logo, it can then ask you questions to go, okay, well, what kind of things do you want? What do you think about colors or tone or text font, all of those things, to help you think that through. And then you can give it to someone else who can realize that in a much better way than just having months of that conversation back and forth. So I've taken that design t-shirt concept here for the demo to again highlight that image generation aspect of ChatGPT. So I've put it in here. So what I'm asking for it to do is to do a few design concepts for our fundraising event for the Cambridge Half Marathon. I wanted to focus on the key themes of community, running, and inclusivity. I want both symbols and phrases. And I wanted to design 3 different concepts for us to so this is absolutely, I have no idea what I want. Give me some designs to help me refine what I think. Again, what does it think? And then help it rate those designs. So we put that in. It's got a question around Cambridge. Do we want any Cambridge specific landmarks? Which is a great question I hadn't even thought of. So I'm going to say, yes, these include. And I'll specify Cambridge, UK, because I'm not sure if I had said that already, just in case it decides to go Cambridge, Massachusetts. And so it's come up with Run Together, Rise Together as its first concept, and using the famous Bridge of Sighs, Miles of Memories, showing a line art depiction, and Together for Tomorrow, showing runners and punters. So here we can go, I love the Together for Tomorrow design. Please, can you mock that up? Obviously, in reality, I would suggest talking to your team, getting some feedback from fundraisers, from runners. But again, just for the demo, the design image takes slightly longer, but here we go. This is its first draft. You can tell, and this is why you still very much do need to work with human designers, spelling in images is very iffy. So it's managed to get some of that spelt properly, but you can see at the bottom, Cambridge Half Marathon is already starting to look a bit odd. But this is, a great place that you could start with and go, actually, to the human designer, I would like this color font. I would like the text laid out a little bit differently. I like that we've got the bridge in, but actually let's get rid of the houses. And you can then refine it much more rather than just having that concept, we need a t-shirt, but I don't even know where to begin with it. And then my final example is around how it can really help as a sounding board. So especially working in small charities or tiny charities, you may not have many peers. You may be the only person doing your role in the organization. And it can be very difficult to sense check things without it feeling like you are already presenting the idea for sort of either sign off or official feedback from team members. And so generative AI can be helpful as being that critical friend as you're still early stage conceptualizing or thinking something through. So it can give that early stage feedback, areas for development, and really test things out before you're ready to give it to the board or give it to your line manager or people that you're managing yourself. And an example for this is so writing a draft strategy. So especially in the early stages, you might be coming up with that idea, but you don't know if you're on the right track. I mean, very few of us are trained in how to write strategies, especially when we're working in tiny organizations. And so this is something I've, again, very much personally used it for, to come up with just that initial feedback so I can test if I've completely gone off the deep end or if I'm on the right track with what I've come up with. So here I've got, again, another example. I have created a draft strategy for this fake charity, and I want it to take on the role of a strategic advisor with expertise. And I want it to give me very much feedback on how clear, impactful, and aligned the strategy is that I've come up with separately. And very specific, I want to know if I've completely forgotten anything, because that is always when you're working alone in a room, you never know what you haven't realized to include. And again, asking it questions and asking it to rate itself. So it's already reviewed it. It thinks I've done well on financial sustainability, but that I need to have a bit more on how we pick which grants we're going to work with, what might be the framework of value proposition for corporate partnerships. And also in my strategy, I hadn't included anything about donor retention, so it's already picking that up for me. And it's going through every different aspect of what I've done. It's giving a rating of, you've done this much, but you need to improve in these areas. And firstly, it's given me a little bit of a confidence boost to go, I'm on the right track. It's thinking I'm done an 8 out of 10, but it's already highlighted a lot of questions and areas for further exploration. And so again, this is where taking it forward, I would then refine, bring it back, give me a bit more feedback. And then when I feel like, yes, this is what I've wanted, that's when I would take it externally to the board. And again, with the topic of this presentation is saving time, but I think it's also about improving the quality of what you're doing. So you might end up spending that full hour that you would have anyway, but the output is so much higher than you would have if you had just sat there pulling your own hair out, as I have often done, not quite sure if I'm on the right track. It just helps move things along much faster and means that you ultimately end up in a much better place in a shorter period of time. So hopefully with all of those demos, there's at least something everyone in the room can relate to and relate to their roles. But I do highly encourage experimenting, and with any activity you're doing, just thinking, is there a role for Gen AI here? Can it help me review this or identify if there's something missing, or just start conceptualizing something I've been sitting on? But you will have seen as I was going through, I wrote very long prompts. And this is a model of prompting that was developed by Dan Fitzpatrick for working with schools that I have found incredibly helpful. And it follows a very clear formula, and it drastically improves the outputs that AI comes up with. So I'll go through it. It's called the prepare model. The first P starts for prompt, which is what is the outcome you want? And so be very specific about what it is you want the AI to do. So you saw with all of them, I started by saying, help me summarize this or generate these t-shirt ideas. It's making that first couple of sentences of this is precisely what I want you to do. Then you go on to saying what role you want it to fulfill in doing that. So do you want a critical friend? Do you want a marketing expert to look at this? Do you want a small charity expert looking at this? Or if it's generating content you're going to use, what role within the organization is it writing it from? Is it writing it as a volunteer? Is it writing it as a charity manager? Is it writing it as a trustee? And it then helps it shape what tone and style it should use in whatever output it comes up with. Next is being explicit about what's important. So these are really a lot of that context that it needs. So are there specific points or details? Are you wanting it to highlight what you've done well so you feel more confident, or are you wanting it to rip it apart so you see where you've gone wrong? If it's, let's say, writing a fundraising letter, this is where you would say all of those details of we raised this much from these people, and you need to include that in the letter. And this is slightly related to then parameters, which is what are your restrictions? So that's your word count, that's your use British English spelling, that's your write in prose and paragraphs or write in bullet points, or if you're designing an image, use these colors because that's our branding colors. So really make sure that it's got very clear constraints about what it wants to do. And always ask it if it needs anything more from you. So we saw with the t-shirt design, it wanted to know whether I wanted Cambridge landmarks included. Other times it might ask you for more context about the organization or the task that you want it to do. So it's a really good sense check to see if you've done a good prompt, to see if it's got any questions for you to enhance what it ultimately comes up with. And so I would suggest, if you are doing this on your own, this is the point that you press enter. So make sure all of these things are in there, then press enter, see what comes back, and then ask it to rate its own response. And I'll come on to in a moment why it's useful to break those steps up when you're actually doing this in your own time. But ask it to go, out of 10, how well have you addressed what I've asked you to do? And the beauty of generative AI at the moment is because it isn't conscious, it is just a machine, it has no emotional attachment to what it's already done. So it will then go back and it will, as objectively as it can, review what it's come up with and find ways that it can be improved. So it is very useful in thinking critically and in evaluating for it to review itself. And then finally, always remember the step of you as the human, as the responsible and owner of this output. Make sure you edit it and review it and make any changes you think is necessary. I have now gone into the mode, as I've mentioned before, of going back and forth on rate and edit. So we get a very intentional prompt that might take a couple of minutes to write. It comes out, it rates it, I edit it, I put it back, it rates it, I edit it, we put it back, and we kind of go through that cycle a couple of times. And the value of that is, again, by the time you've done that, and when I say by the time, this again might only take 5 or 10 minutes, it just means that it much more represents your tone, your voice, and it isn't just a Gen AI output. It is very much an amalgamation of you and the tool, so that it doesn't just feel like someone's just put in a one-sentence prompt, you've ripped it off, put it on the internet, and whatever the consequences are. So it does end up with much more tailored, much more personalized outputs. So hopefully that already gives you a good foundation, but for those of you who are further along your AI journeys, I thought I'd just give a final couple of tips and tricks that you might want to consider that help that prompt craft go to an even higher level. So if you've never done the prepare model before, you don't need to now take it further, but just to show that there are ways to improve it even beyond that. First is what is referred to as few-shot learning. And this is where you actually give the AI examples of what you want it to come up with. So if you're, let's say, asking it to help you write a thank you letter to new donors, you can, as part of your prompt, say, here is an example of a previous letter we've written before. Use the same tone and style, and it just gives it even more context to then come up with something that's more closely aligned to your expectations and is more tailored to your expectations. So again, if you're writing a report and you've got something you can share with it, say, this is the layout, use it from this report, this is the tone, this is the level of professionalism, for example, that we want you to represent in what you now put out yourself. Chain of thought is for when you have a longer thing that you want AI to help with, and it helps you break down that activity into logical steps that AI can do with you one at a time. So let's say you are trying to write a new report. Rather than asking it to help to write the full thing straight off the bat, it can be helpful to say, we're going to write this report for my board. It's going to have an executive summary, an introduction, background, research findings, recommendations, conclusions. Those are going to be our headings. Let's write each section one by one, taking the rough notes I'll share with you as we go along. And that helps it know what its overall task is going to be. And with that context, then help you with each sort of subsection. And the benefit of doing this is, regardless of what Gen AI tool you're using, it will have a limit on how much it can do in just one response to you. So the free versions, it might be that it can only generate a couple of paragraphs worth of material. With the paid for versions, it may still be, a few thousand words. So if you're trying to help write a report, it's not going to be able to do a particularly good job in just those 2,000 words. But if for every section you suddenly increase that limit, it means that you can get much more detailed, much better outputs that you can then sort of copy and paste together into a separate document. But to do that, it's really helpful for it to have that chain of thought of first we'll do this, then we'll do this, then we'll do this, then we'll do this, to then put that together. The final thing is emotional prompting. So generative AI does not have any emotions, but it has a concept of what emotions are. And so putting in what emotions you want it to reflect in the outputs does actually help. So saying write it with enthusiasm or empathy, it does actually come up with things that emulate that in the output that it comes up with. Obviously, then critical thinking, you can then apply that and make sure that it reflects the tone that you wanted. I would always emphasize a lot of these tools have been developed in the United States, and their approach to enthusiasm is a whole different level to British enthusiasm. And so you often have to tone it down if you're doing it for British audiences. But again, that's where you're applying your critical thinking and you're thinking of suitability. And the final thing is about self-reflection prompting. So we've touched on this through the rate step, but you can apply that to all different aspects. So as I mentioned earlier with thinking about some of the biases that might be built in, that is a good way to get it to self-reflect and go, we're working with this vulnerable community. Are you inadvertently perpetuating any stereotypes in what you've come up with? And it can go, actually, since you've prompted me to think about that, yes, this is a thing that I'm doing. And so I would adjust it in this way. And so you can ask it to self-reflect across a whole spectrum of things, not just how well have you answered my prompt. So hopefully that's given you a nutshell on different ways you can use it, how you can use it effectively, ultimately with that intention to both save time and improve your efficiency.